Welcome to the fourth installment of the second year of our seminar series. Today, we are excited to host a very special guest, Jason Moore. But before that, let me briefly introduce Planecology to those encountering it for the first time. Planecology is a collective set out with a Marxist perspective to contribute to the development of a Marxist ecological awareness, both in the ecological movement and the socialist movement. Planecology aims to promote international Marxist ecological literature and to develop the partnership with movements in other countries. In line with the needs of the struggle, it aims to develop new organizations and platforms to create an ecological movement in which rural and urban toilers and oppressed, and especially women and young people, become subjects and leaders. As Planecology, we invite everyone to join our collective who considers that the ecological struggle should be a part of the struggle for social liberation against capitalism, and that it should be organized in a way that will spread to all of it, and who want to be involved in a development and implementation of a new program and strategy in this direction. Before we start, let me also briefly introduce Jason to all of you. Jason Moore is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he is professor of sociology. He leads the World Ecology Research Collective, and he is the author of numerous essays, book chapters, and path-breaking books. His Capitalism in the Web of Life, published 2015, is available in Turkish, along with a history of the world in 7 chapters, which co-authored with Raj Patel. We are thrilled to announce that we are currently working on the translation of a selection of his essays, which will be published as a book as part of Planecology publications early next year. Also, before we start, let me express our gratitude to our translators, Barış Yıldırım and Osman İşçi. Without those support, this event will not be possible. Well, Jason, welcome.
It's a thrill to be here.
So, with reference to the titles of today's seminar, let me first ask you if you could clarify the terms in the title for us. What is zombie capitalism? What is planetary management or goods science? And how does it relate to the concept of the Anthropocene? We know that you are very critical about this latter term. So, Jason.
Well, let's begin with the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene means literally age of man, and its epistemological, scientific, philosophical roots go to the origins of capitalism, the invention of the civilizing project as the geocultural form of imperialist conquest. Imperialist conquest for what? Well, for cheap labor above all, because the great crisis afflicting late medieval Europe's ruling classes was the underproduction of labor power. And from this stemmed a grand reimagining of not only the cosmology, but of the world into man versus nature, but also into concrete imperialist strategies to secure cheap and tractable labor power. As we know, as many of us are familiar, the history of capitalist proletarianization is a history of the securing of unpaid work, the unpaid work of humans, but also of the rest of nature. So therefore, the conflict is not one of man and nature, but of class in the web of life. That what we are looking at from the origins of capitalism is a climate class conjuncture in which, as Matt Huber and I and many others have taken to saying, the climate crisis is a class struggle. Now, we disagree over the terms of this and how this looks, and we can get into that. But we want to just insist that we start to look in a radical way at the ideological framing of our era as the age of man. And in my opinion, it is completely incompatible with any honest, ruthlessly critical socialist perspective to take on board the imagination and the culture and the language of the imperialists, which is always man versus nature. Why is that dangerous? For many reasons. One of them, and we can unpack them, is what Claudia von Wehrhoff once said. Nature, with the rise of capitalism, became everything the bourgeoisie did not want to pay for. So that's one moment of it. What does zombie capitalism mean? It means that capitalism's inner core is dead. Its historic, geographical methods of crisis resolution, captured in David Harvey's famous slogan of the spatial fix, is now exhausted. It's exhausted for many reasons. Some of them have to do with the enclosure of the atmospheric commons and the resulting climate crisis. Some of them have to do with the enclosure of cheap aquatic and terrestrial frontiers of unpaid work, of human work, but also the work of the rest of nature, what I will call a biotariat. And we can see this practically in at least three major domains, this zombie capitalism. And the slogan is intended as an antidote to the belief of many people, including radicals, in capitalism's resilience today. They say, oh, capitalism has overcome many crises in the past. But they don't actually look at how capitalism has overcome these crises in the past. And how it has overcome those previous crises is overwhelmingly and strategically by moving to new frontiers of cheap nature, where the four cheap elements, or just four cheaps, but the four cheap elements can be found: cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials. Again, everything ultimately comes down to the value of labor power in a classic Marxist sense, which arms us politically with some crucial insights. But I'll come back to that. Capitalism today no longer has frontiers to fix its problems of overaccumulation. And we see this in three major domains. One is the massive overaccumulation of capital. There are many indicators. We have brilliant Marxist political economists organizing this event, and they can correct me where I'm wrong. But there is a massive overaccumulation of capital. There are $17 trillion in capital parked in zero or negative rate of return government securities. There is an ongoing deceleration or slowing growth of agricultural productivity since the 1980s, partly as a result of climate change, pure and simple, but also partly owing to the limits of the toxification regime and the labor regime and how all of those are fitting together. So in other words, the agricultural model that has made capitalism possible, from the Dutch and English and sugar plantation revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries, all the way to the green revolutions of the 20th century, they succeeded by producing more and more food with less and less labor power. That era is now over. Those possibilities for a new agricultural revolution are definitively closed. And then last but not least is the question raised in recent years by Jason Smith and Aaron Bananov and David Graeber and many others, which is raising the question of why was there no new scientific technological revolution in labor productivity in the 1970s. And that is something that, except for Marxist economists, nobody wants to touch. And so there's an intellectual disconnect that is ideologically conditioned, that radical scholars have been trained to fragment the world instead of traveling freely across all these domains. And then very, very quickly, because I know this is a long introduction to a short but important question, is the question of good science. Good science should chill us to our very bones. Good science is today's version of what Jürgen Habermas in the 1960s called scientism. And basically what he was talking about was the conversion of the messy and contentious processes of a democratic society into technocratic and managerial formulas. And so that is scientism. It has a very long history that goes all the way back to Descartes and the Cartesian Revolution, but it also has a recent history that long predates modern environmentalism and environmental management. It goes to the establishment of American world hegemony after World War II. And this was subsequently developed in large measure through the war machine and the construction of nuclear hegemony, and we can get into that. But this managerial philosophy of converting everything into a managerial and technocratic process rather than a political process is at the heart not just of modern politics, but also of mainstream environmentalism, of the environmentalism of the rich. And so the real danger today is not climate doom. The real danger is not that human existence is threatened. The real danger is that we live in the midst of what Samir Amin called a decadent transition, engineered on the part of the Euro-American ruling classes, with some others, maybe Japanese ruling class and a few other allies around the world, to engineer a transition to a post-capitalist order that will balance the costs of climate adjustment on the backs and bellies and shoulders of the bottom 80% of the world population. I fear that this is where discourses that have many, many positive elements, where discourses like the Green New Deal, degrowth, and other sustainability discourses will be co-opted and ideologized forcefully by the world's ruling classes, this Davos, Pentagon, Wall Street, White House alliance to engineer a post-capitalist tradition. They are already aggressively marketing ideas like planetary stewardship, nature positive, and all the rest, along with sustainable development, to persuade us to demobilize and to place our faith in a technocratic and, I fear, increasingly authoritarian and dystopian post-capitalist transition to address the climate crisis. So those are the three elements: good science, zombie capitalism, and the Anthropocene Capitalocene debate.
All right, thank you so much for clarifying. Following this, your reading of historical capitalism is not confined to exploitation. It carefully studies how capital appropriated new resource frontiers in order to ensure its development. So what are these frontiers, and how did capitalism or colonization take advantage of them? And what are some contemporary examples of this process?
Okay, so the first thing that we want to remember, against the trend of a certain kind of progressive neoliberalism that masquerades as a radical critique, that colonialism is not about land. Colonialism was a historically and geographically specific system of formal imperial rule. And it was the bourgeoisie's preferred way of organizing the class struggle and of organizing classes. And this can't be said enough, because there is a progressive neoliberal trend to present colonialism as a clash of civilizations between the bad Europeans and the virtuous victims everywhere else. And while there is no question that European capitalist empires behaved very, very ruthlessly, violently, aggressively, this was not a clash of civilizations. In fact, that was their view. That was the imperialist view of the world, to see the process of conquest as a civilizing project against the savage human beings. And then at a certain point in the 19th century, or 20th century rather, we know that language of the civilizing project was reinvented into developed and undeveloped, because it was considered politically incorrect by the imperial masters of the universe in Washington, D.C., to call people savages. They had to be called undeveloped, or people searching for democracy and freedom, this whole rhetoric. So we want to keep that in mind, that imperialism is fundamentally about securing labor power. And yet, at the same time, let's take Marx's insight about a labor ontology and the dialectics of humans in the web of life very seriously. He says famously, and there's no more clear exposition of the dialectical method and the philosophy of historical materialism than this, that a human being that does not have its essence outside itself is not a living human, is not a species, a mode of production, a form of class exploitation that does not have its essence outside itself. In that classic rendering of the interpenetration of opposites, is not actually a historical being, it is an abstract and idealized being. Thus, for Marx, there is no man versus nature conflict as eternal verities. In fact, he and Engels begin with a critique of this. This is, as Engels says in that famous essay, The Transition from Ape to Man, the role of labor in the transition from ape to man. He says, through labor, man creates himself. Through labor, nature is also created. Now, of course, nature exists in some abstract sense before that, but in the real active materialist conception, that's fundamental. And this is very important. This might sound very removed, but it's not, because the opposite, the passive materialism of metabolic rift and man against nature, says that comes first and then labor response. That is not Marx's perspective. That is not a dialectical perspective. And their materialism does not go deep enough. We need a truly revolutionary materialism. Now, okay, frontiers. Every great era of capitalist accumulation, from the Industrial Revolution of the 16th century to the late 19th and early 20th century, to the era of monopoly capitalism, and so on and so forth. All of those great industrial revolutions are premised on a new imperialism. Now, we know that phrase from David Harvey. David Harvey took it from the historiography of the new imperialism of the late 19th century, but it didn't all begin there. It goes all the way back to the origins of capitalism. What was Columbus about? It was about a new imperialism. This was not like the Crusades. It was not like the Reconquista. It was not like medieval wars. It was a solution to the interminable medieval wars that occurred at the end of the crisis of feudalism. So we want to keep in mind that these were again and again movements of cheap nature. They were imperialist fixes to the problems of the underproduction of labor power and the availability and the cost of the other three cheaps. So remember, I said there are four cheap elements: labor, food, energy, and raw materials. Now, if food is not cheap, labor is relatively expensive. That's an underproduction of labor power crisis. If the objects of labor and the inputs to the production process, that is energy and other raw materials, captured in Marx's formulation of circulating constant capital. Remember, there's fixed capital and there's circulating capital as two dialectically antagonistic moments of constant capital. Everybody forgets about this, but we can't forget that, because the rate of profit is inverse to those value compositions. That these other three elements are necessary from the point of view of capital to ensure a high and rising rate of surplus value extraction. Now, to your point, the process of exploitation of labor by capital, the workers are exploited by capital, depends on forms of domination. And this is where dynamics of what I call Prometheanism, which is supposedly of man over nature, of sexism, of man over woman, of racism, of white over non-white, come into being. And they all have a common thread of a naturalized discourse. So bourgeois naturalism is the beating heart of these forms of domination. This is not an argument for intersectionality. This is an argument that naturalism comes first, and then historically, as we could see, the world color line, or what I call climate apartheid, forms, and then climate patriarchy forms. This is the fantastic narrative that Silvia Federici gives us. What she sees but doesn't quite see is that the climate crisis of that era And the class struggles of early capitalism are struggles over the underproduction of labor power, which he does see. What I'm saying is that there's a climate moment to it, and that this is therefore a moment of climate patriarchy. So these frontiers continue to roll out again and again and again. What's happening today? Yes, you see places like Amazonia, palm oil frontiers in Sumatra. But here is the thing about today's frontiers. They are smaller than ever before, and the mass of capital, the mass of overaccumulated capital is greater than ever before. There are no frontiers today in the way that they have existed that will rescue capitalism. Capitalism is a zombie formation. It is dead inside, but it's deadly and moving.
Right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for clarification. So this question a little bit long and includes several questions. So recently, more and more people criticize what they call anthropocentrism and suggest an extended notion of work. What is work for you? Do animals work? Do forests work? If yes, how does that work relate to the production of value? If not, why? And also, this is an important question since the opponents of anthropocentrism argue that the division between human and non-human natures reproduce the hierarchical narrative of the Anthropocene. And apart from this, but in relation to it, there is the question of non-production labor, or for instance, reproduction of labor. Is care a sort of work, for example? So these questions are important. They are related to the question of what the term the working class or working classes compromise. So, yeah.
This is a fundamental question to our times. And as I've been arguing over the past few years, the proletariat under capitalism is in fact what I call a planetary proletariat, in which the wage work and unpaid work performed by humans and the rest of nature form a dialectical totality of proletariat, femitariat, that is, of unpaid human work, not necessarily performed by female, but feminized under the reign of capital, and the biotariat. And this is not a taxonomy. We are all biotarians. And this is fundamental, I think, to the Marxist revolutionary project from Marx himself. We can remember, or you can go back and read on the Jewish question, where Marx is addressing Thomas Munzer, the communist priest from the Great Peasant War of 1525, who was executed for his political rebellion. Who decries the poisoning of the air and the water, that everything now has a price tag attached to it. He says, in a revolutionary project, the creatures too must go free. So in one sense, I'm very sympathetic to many of the arguments that say, for instance, that animals work. On the other hand, there is always the tendency of a vulgar materialism and a tendency to fragment reality and to create a democratic theory of causation in which all facts and all agencies are created equal. That is, in fact, a liberal bourgeois conception. That's pluralism and empiricism in the ways that have achieved hegemony in the bourgeois social sciences are today often dressed up with a radical sounding rhetoric. And we see this across environmental studies. We see this, unfortunately, in animal studies, too, which wants to combat the perceived anthropocentrism with a perceived biocentrism. Both are fetishes. Both are, in fact, thought abstractions. Now, there is under capitalism, a real cultural and ideological divide between humanity and nature, understood not as thought abstractions, but as real abstractions. And you might recall from the German ideology, Marx and Engels talk about ruling ideas. And so I talk about ruling abstractions. Nature and society are ruling abstractions. Humanity is a ruling abstraction, a kind of fetish on steroids, a fetish on methamphetamine, all right, that it creeps into our intellectual DNA and it leads us to speak in ways that favor the bourgeois view of the world, the boss's view of the world. So what we want to do is, as ever, go back to the dialectical interpenetration of opposites of the value form itself. And that means that value is riven by its and interpenetrating the contradictions of the price form and the use values that are themselves socially produced. So use values are not just things that are found in nature. That's a vulgar materialist view that eco-Marxists have given us. That's absolutely false, that resources become, use values become. Marx is very clear on this, that use values are not just there for all times and places, but we have this interpenetration of exchange and use value in the value form. And that, I think, is the key to understanding how the socially necessary relations of unpaid work, the unpaid work of care, for instance, the unpaid work of animals, of forests, of all forms, are dialectically interpenetrated with the value form and with the proletarian condition. Thus, that proletarian and biotarian and femitarian are dialectically interpenetrating moments of each other, in which the antagonism of use and exchange, of what Marx in the Grundrisse calls economic equivalence and natural distinctness, that has to be put squarely, that dialectical tension has to be put squarely in front of us in order to grasp these conditions. In other words, to put it glibly, housewife and proletarian, in, for instance, Maria Mies's famous formulation, is the form of use value and exchange value, that antagonism. They are homologous forms. They are not identical forms. They are different, but they realize the same structure in the form of appearance and play out the antagonisms of the law of value under capitalism from the very beginning. So I think that has to be the beginning, instead of that vulgar materialist approach of say, well, they're anthropocentrists, so we need an ecocentric approach. That is simply inverting bourgeois thought and celebrating what was once denounced, which is a habit of radical procedure. Val Plumwood, the great feminist philosopher, identified this. She said the inversion of the terms of a dualism is the affirmation of the violence of that dualism.
So related this one, probably the next question is going to even elaborate more on your thoughts. This question is about the agency. So what do you think about the criticisms of the concept of capitalism ignores the limits of nature, that it's not human-centered, but capital-centered, and therefore it ignores the struggle of the working class as a subject? An argument raised in the context of Asian structure, the debate is that the following: if capitalism makes the cheap resources more and more expensive by destroying ecosystems, and if an epochal crisis is expected as a consequence, so what is the role of revolutionary subject here? And some people argue that the agent or the subject in your framework is nature rather than the working class. So what do you think about those critics, and where does posthumanism or new materialism take place in your work?
Well, let's do the easy part first. Posthumanism includes both Marxists and anti-Marxists. So it's hard to paint with a broad brush. I've never identified myself as a posthumanist. Even more to the point, I wrote Capitalism in the Web of Life as a critique and an alternative to both the new materialism, but also the petty bourgeois causal pluralism of people like Latour. So let's be clear about that. The other is, I'm always surprised to hear those characterizations of the capitalist theme thesis. I realize that reading comprehension is not easy to realize, but there is something that is going on within the left these days, and it has a broader resonance, that careful reading is in very short supply. So in my experience, and you can come back to me with specific lines of critique, but that these are people who are more interested in a kind of academically inflected political point scoring that is, as I pointed out in print, very sectarian and reveals, in fact, all the same tendencies of pick your favorite group that you dislike who's sectarian, whether they're Maoist or anarchist or Trotskyist or whomever. All those behaviors apply, especially to people like Bellamy Foster and Andreas Malm, who are frankly dishonest characters in relation to my work. Believe nothing about what they say about my work, because I read them and I recognize nothing that's there. You can go and look at my work stretching back 2 decades. Indeed, let's pick on Bellamy Foster, who for decades had nothing to say about class politics or class struggle. For 20 years, I argued that the origins of capitalism come about as a result of class struggle. And you can go and look at the essays, one of which, this long essay on nature and the transition from feudalism to capitalism, you are translating. Thank you. It's a very long essay. I hope it helps to clarify some of these issues. But I'm shocked to see that people are saying, well, there's no agency and more. In fact, if you go and look at Capitalism and the Web of Life, there are in a book that is about 300 pages of text, there are over 200 references to class. Class formation, class struggle, bourgeoisification, proletarianization, class conflict, capital labor conflict, peasant revolts. These are, in fact, all over Capitalism and the Web of Life. They are fundamental to the perspective of world ecology. World ecology as a conversation and a perspective is essentially this. It's an elaboration of the anti-imperialist class struggle analysis that was launched by third world Marxists long before there was a third world, by Rosa Luxemburg, Frantz Fanon, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney, all of these folks. And if you look at the people who are making the argument that these mischaracterizations, who are they? They are intellectuals from the global north who, Andreas Malm is a prime example, who writes a book on the origins of fossil capital without a single serious discussion of imperialism, of slavery, and of the cotton gin. And that's not only bad history, it's also directly contrary to what Marx says, Volume 3 of Theories of Surplus Value. Only because of the fall in the price of cotton does large-scale industry unfold and develop in the way that it does. And you can go find that quote in some of the essays I've written. I'm not one of these people who believes Marx was right about everything, but if you're going to stake your critique on an orthodoxy of Marx, you should get it right. And in this case, this goes to the intellectual sloppiness that I think is induced by a political sectarianism that is absolutely destructive on the socialist left. That notwithstanding my efforts to reach out and reach across the divides between different traditions of Marxism, what I'm finding is that the class struggle emphasis of recent authors is a kind of class formalism, specifically of the kind that goes back to Second International economism, that is before World War I. It is an economism of the sort Lenin criticizes in What Is to Be Done in 1901, 1902, that this is a crisis of the imagination and the politics of class struggle that abstracts from the imperialist moment. And so I'm rather surprised to see people saying, well, there's no class struggle in Moore's work. What the heck are you talking about? Are you even reading these texts? And so in a way, sometimes in my calmer moments, and this is not one of my calmer moments, but in my calmer moments, I feel bad for these people who can't be troubled to actually read the class struggle analysis that is there. And for those who are curious about a more elaborated version that is specifically targeted towards this question, I have just published in the Journal of World Systems Research the part 2 of my essay power, profits, and Prometheanism. And I'll conclude on this. There's a problem, as you indicated, on the right with a kind of agency of nature perspective. That's absolutely wrong. It's essentially a woke version of limits to growth thinking. And I wrote Capitalism and the Web of Life as a critique of limits to growthism. We need a critique of this supposedly orthodox class analysis that is, in fact, a return to the economism of the Second International. And even though discursively it embraces people like Lenin, it has no interest in, say, Lenin's very heterodox class analysis. And for that, you can simply go back to the development of capitalism in Russia, where he reformulates revolutionary Marxism to understand class formation within the countryside, the proletarianization and semi-proletarianization of the poor peasantry. And he even explicitly warns other Marxists. He said, we must guard against an excessively stereotyped view of the worker, that it's not just this landless wage worker. It assumes many complex forms. And so in the resurgence and reassertion of a certain kind of orthodox workerism, they are in fact returning to a kind of left-wing social democracy and a kind of revolutionary syndicalism that says, well, we're going to have an economic conception of class struggle. That's false and indeed dangerous in the moment of planetary crisis.
Thank you for response. I think it's quite important, those debates, to clarify how we think about.
But the tragedy is that despite, so I'm very animated here, but I want to be clear that I have said and continue to say very complimentary things, not only about John Bellamy Foster and Andreas Malm and Matt Huber and many of these other folks. They refuse to do that. They are engaged in a Hobbesian war of all against all. This is not a comradely struggle in which a theoretical struggle, as Marx liked to say, is necessary to the generation of new ideas and new analyses to be as radical as reality itself. That's what Lenin liked to talk about. We need to be as radical as reality itself. But they refuse this because they prefer their sectarian mindset. They refuse to say anything that's positive about the anti-imperialist class struggle perspective, which is always a class struggle on the web of life. So there's a great tragedy that is going on in the world left today.
Well, it's good to mention about the imperialism because the next question is about it. So it will give a more chance to elaborate the concept. So again, what about imperialism? That you're also criticizing some of the Marxists about there not being considering imperialism seriously. So we know that your approach capitalism is a world system, which implies uneven, exploitative, and oppressive relations between core capitalist economies and the periphery. And of course, we know the dynamics, the core and periphery is quite dynamic historically. And do you think an environmentalism without an explicit position on imperialism is possible? And what possible are practical political implications of the emphasis on the imperialism in terms of environmental struggles in the global north and global south?
Well, in my view, we ought to stop calling ourselves environmentalists. Environmentalism is an objectively right-wing ideology that from time to time has entertained social democratic impulses. But the mask has come off. Look at the German Green Party, the architects of German rearmament, the greatest boosters of the NATO war in Ukraine, which is a war against Belt and Road. Make no mistake about it. However you want to come down on, there's plenty of criticism to go around on all sides of that conflict, but it is clearly driven by the imperialist powers. And in my view, and of course, I'm not the one to invent this critique, the coming war with China is not in China, it's in Africa. And we're seeing this right now with the ongoing geopolitical tensions in Niger. So an anti-imperialist perspective is fundamental because the problem is fundamentally imperialist and world historical. And we need to find ways to revolutionize the relations between working classes in the imperialist countries and the semi-periphery and the peripheries. Now, for me, I've never called myself a world systems analyst, but I was always sympathetic to Wallerstein for several reasons. One of which is that he was always anti-imperialist. Second, he was historical. And third, he was a class struggle Marxist. There's a term that circulates within certain forms of academic Marxism called political Marxism. And this is often associated with the work of Robert Brenner. Now, personally, I'm a huge fan of Bob Brenner. I'm a huge fan of political Marxists. I think that they have fundamental insights. Basically, what they're saying is that political power is necessary to create the conditions, including the conditions of class formation, necessary for capitalism. Where they go wrong, in my view, is they are methodologically nationalist. They see everything unfolding within nation states, a position that doesn't serve them well, I would say. So in my view, Wallerstein was always a geopolitical Marxist. That is, he saw imperialism, the politics of imperialism, as fundamental to establishing the conditions of the law of value and the worldwide law of value, indeed. Now, this leads me to a position that I've often articulated online and elsewhere, that the first responsibility of anyone concerned with climate justice is an anti-imperialist struggle that says, for instance, the European armies must be withdrawn from sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world. The American network of bases around the world has to be closed down. And this is a point where a revolutionary imaginary can, and a left-wing anti-imperialism can join forces in a provisional and temporary way with right-wing anti-imperialists. In the United States, for instance, the leading voices against American militarization in Africa are not from the social democratic left, but from the right-wing anti-imperialist left. And that's very, very important in the present struggle. This takes us, we must insist on the imperialist countries withdrawing their armies, the French from withdrawing their armies from the CFA zone, the US from withdrawing their armies everywhere. And we cannot hope for anything that resembles a democratic transition and a climate justice transition without the removal of the armies, and especially of the special forces units. The US has trained and equipped special forces missions operating in, wait for it, 75% of the world's countries. All right, so we are dealing with a very, very dangerous moment in the world. And if you look at the mainstream environmentalist discourse, and I point this out about the Anthropocene concept all the time, the Anthropocene comes in at the very moment of the American launching of its forever wars. Fully 1/3 of all American foreign military interventions, which is about 170 foreign military interventions in its whole history, has occurred since 1999. That is in the very era of the Anthropocene. So I hear leftists saying, oh, we can use the Anthropocene concept. If you are not explicitly linking the Anthropocene concept to its greenwashing of imperialism, then blood is on your hands.
Well, yes, thank you. So again, I think the following question is a good complementary in opening new strategies for international struggle. So we as Poland Ecology Collective have been thinking over lasting regional and international alliances, of course, but not only among Marxist ecology organizations and movements. So the notion of climate justice or environmental justice, ecological depth, and that like to seem to be crucial here, especially for international initiatives. So what are your thoughts on this point? You already started the talking about this, but like in general about international solidarity and struggle.
Well, it's a big question.
Yeah.
And I think I think the first premise of our international cooperation, maybe the first two. One is that we need to reveal the ideological and financial power of the leading foundations, of the billionaire foundations in the world that are fueling and financing an NGO industrial complex across the global South. Their purpose is specifically to demobilize and contain the dangerous classes, as people used to say in the 19th century, and to co-opt a section of what is variably called the middle strata, the professional managerial class of intellectuals who are working in these civil society groups. There are some civil society groups that are doing heroic, courageous frontline work. However, in the main, what we have seen in the neoliberal era is a form of ideological and cultural counterinsurgency. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, as many of us know, the CIA ran a cultural Cold War program all across, especially Western Europe, but many other places in the world as well. Today, that work is carried out by the foundations and by CIA fronts like the National Endowment for Democracy and other institutions of soft power that have been intimately linked to so-called color revolutions across especially Eurasia. So we want to reveal that. And then I think we also need to stop being afraid of state power. And a certain neoliberalization of the radical imagination occurred, which said we don't need to deal with state power. And here's the thing, that the climate crisis is increasingly understood, conceptualized by the transnational capitalist classes in the world. They are developing, perhaps chaotically, perhaps not fully in a fully coordinated way, but they are developing soft power and hard power strategies to deal with the climate transition that is coming up. This is very clear. The American drive for unipolar hegemony, a strategy that is now in shambles, of course, but that drive is reflective of the imperial drive to find a way through the climate crisis that will maintain the existing inequality of wealth and power in the world, but probably in a different form. Bob Brenner would call this political accumulation. Samir Amin essentially argues for a similar transition around a tributary mode of production, but essentially towards a post-capitalist social system in which there will be markets, there will be finance, there will be many of the trappings of capitalist society, but its overarching architecture of capital accumulation will be politically secured. And so the super centralization of capital will lead to a political dynamic of too big to fail. And we've already seen that in motion. That was how the Great Recession in the US and the UK was resolved. So our strategies need to become very conscious about how to use state power to, again, borrowing from Samir Amin, to de-link. And as I say this, I want to be very careful because Amin spent his life trying to disabuse people of the idea that de-linking was autarky. De-linking is not autarky. That is not what he's saying. De-linking is the reassertion of national priorities in a polycentric world under popular mobilization. And so de-linking is never pretty, it's never pure, in part because the imperialist forces will never allow de-linking to be safe and easy. Just ask the Soviets, just ask the Chinese or the Vietnamese or the Cubans or any number of people, the Angolans, or any other number of people around the world who have experienced the boot heel of imperialism, either directly or indirectly through American power.
So we have some questions from the chat.
Wonderful.
Also, yes, and also I might add some questions too. So the first question, you mentioned about the cheap labor for chips, and people are increasingly talking about fully automated factories. Also, here in Turkey, we observe an increased use of robots and machinery, even retail shops. We know that standard Amazon warehouse looks like, or during the pandemic, the slogan, "You are the product," right, was circulated. Do you think that is demonstrated as a shift of a creation of profit from the sphere of production to circulation or consumption? So what is the role of cheap labor and other cheaps in the context of these change just taking place? And maybe we can the following about like this platformization of labor or digital economies. That's where the companies, the big companies, like accumulating intangible capital, but de-accumulating maybe the tangible capital. About this, how do we merge to make the relationship between like a cheap labor and profits in these concepts?
Well, I don't know about you didn't say dematerialize, but I don't know if I'm convinced by that.
It's like more on accumulation of intangible the capital rather than in the platform economy. Like for example, Uber does not have car, but
Right.
The software, yeah.
Right. So this form of, I don't want to call it automation because it's not really automation, but there's a form of technical innovation that's related to cost cutting. So you go to the supermarket and the supermarket can compel you, the customer, to do the work of checking out, of paying for, of scanning all the goods, of paying, and that reduces their labor costs. That is happening. Overall, however, I'm reminded of Robert Solo's comments about computers in, I think around 1987 in the New York Times Review of Books. He said, computers are everywhere except in the economic data. That is, that what was expected in the 1980s was a new era of productivity advance because of the introduction of personal computers. That never happened. And we have people more expert on these questions than I am, but even the mid-90s uptick of labor productivity looks to me more the result of financialization than actually increasing physical productivity. So the more that these schemes have been talked about, well, we're going to have robot factories. Andrew Yang in the United States ran a presidential campaign saying automation is killing our jobs. No, it was not. Outsourcing, maybe. Cost cutting, maybe. Creating new, more precarious, informal systems of work, maybe, but not automation. That productivity, there was no new productivity revolution. And that, I suppose there are debates around all of that, but I am convinced both by non-Marxists like the economist Gordon Wood, am I right? Gordon Wood from Northwestern, very useful book on the American experience of productivity revolution, but also, as I mentioned, Jason Smith, Aaron Bananov, James Petrus, many folks who have written about this non-appearance of a new labor productivity revolution. So I think that we want to separate the hype from the reality of this. So I don't see any great new industrial revolution on the horizon. And much of what we see trumpeted as that, most famously Klaus Schwab's fourth industrial revolution, is pure fantasy. I mean, go and read it and decide for yourself. But the idea that 3D printing is going to revolutionize labor productivity, well, there's a lot of talk about that, but there's not much in reality.
Yes, this is. I think I agree with that. Like even like those high-tech companies arguing that we are going to invent like the car without drivers. We are inventing this, but at the end of the day, we don't see them in the rounds. They stop working and financing those projects. They rely on quite cheap labor, I guess. So another question is. So how the relationship between imperialist core and periphery is evolving? Again, another general and big question, but what are your thoughts about this?
Well, let's remember when Wallerstein talks about core and periphery, something funny happened ideologically across neoliberalism. When Wallerstein begins that formulation, he says, look, These are abbreviations for flows of world surplus value. Core and periphery are shorthands for understanding world class formation of proletarianization and bourgeoisification.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I think that vitally necessary in the academic left and for intellectuals around that is to really return to some of these much more serious critiques of imperialism and super exploitation and unequal exchange that were floating around in the 1970s. Now, I don't agree with Argiri Emmanuel, but I think it deserves to be debated. I think Marini's theory of imperialism and super exploitation recently brought into English translation by Monthly Review Press. So a shout out to our comrades at Monthly Review, notwithstanding whatever squabbles we might have. That's important. The work of Andre Gunder Frank, of Emanuel Wallerstein, to understand imperialism as a class struggle. Now, what happened is that world systems people abandoned the class critique, including Wallerstein, and that in environmental circles, all of a sudden, the class critique of unequal exchange that was present in Emmanuel's work, Samir Amin, Gunder Frank. Gunder Frank later was a problem, but Gunder Frank in the 70s had some outstanding analyses of imperialism, of Samir Amin, of course, and then also the Marxist feminist tradition of Maria Mies, Claudia von Verhoeven, Veronica Benholt-Thompson, and others to weave in the gender dynamics of super exploitation and world class struggle and imperialism. This was also fundamental in this moment. And what happened under neoliberalism is that we started to talk about core and periphery as if it was a Weberian income distribution problem. And well, you know, the market distributes wealth and power to some people and not others. And in so-called left environmentalism, there were absolutely retrograde neoliberal figures like Joan Martinez Allier, who is a straight up neo-Malthusian, and Alf Hornborg, who is a vulgar materialist who hates Marx, hates Marxism, and creates these pictures that inequality is about unequal resource flows. And then what we're going to do is we're going to celebrate poor people rebelling against inequality. Now, okay, great. Let's celebrate poor people, but the environmentalism of the poor is not a socialist slogan. It is a kind of liberal, moralistic celebration of the wretched of the earth rebelling because they're rebelling. And okay, up to a point, that's fine, but that's not a theory, and that's not a politics. And so I always like to say that petty bourgeois left-wing intellectuals love to celebrate the poor unless they actually gain power, in which case they hate them. They hate the Soviets. They hate the Chinese. They hate the Angolans. They hate the Cubans, right? You can't take power. That's socialism. That's bad. You can only be victims righteously protesting imperialism and enclosure. All right, so I think that's my answer to the wonderful question of whenever we think about core and periphery, we need to think about that as the imperialist political forms of the class struggle on a world scale, which is always class struggle in the web of life.
Well, thank you so much for, I got another question, which is, again, relating to this. I think I really like this question. So at the opening of your talk, you made reference to these programs, right? The new paradigms of Green New Deal, degrowth, and so forth. So there has been ongoing debate between adherents of these frameworks and Marxists, right? So most importantly, with respect what you mentioned with respect to the role of imperialism and power. So what do you think about the modes on and form of organization? So there's a lot of going on, since Laclau and Moff, like horizontalism, so the new left and so forth. So what is your take with respect to the relationship between local daily struggles and a moment of revolutionary rupture? There's a lot of mention of a post-capitalist future without abolition capitalism itself. And I think this is the last question again, but this is like a big question on the table too.
Well, I think that we need to, of course, all struggles are local. And it was Marx and Engels' insight that capitalism makes everyday life a world historical event. That's more or less a direct quote from the German ideology. And so what we want to do, of course, is advance all local struggles, because in a sense, all struggles are local, but there has to be a national politics to it, and there has to be an internationalist politics to it as well. That let's not entertain the illusion that any meaningful, serious threat to capital's wealth and power will be met passively. And so what I like to encourage people to do is to return to the last moment of revolutionary possibility under capitalism. We are living through a long defeat of the world proletariat since the 1970s. It's not the first time that this has occurred. If you look at the history of the English working class, for instance, between roughly the 1790s and the 1860s, that was also a period of sustained class defeat. So this is not unusual what we've been living through. But what we want to do is to, I think, look very seriously at what happened in the 1970s, not only dramatic moments that are obvious, like the coup in Chile. That's a famous moment. The popular unity understood, but too late, that it had to arm the working class because counter-revolution was coming, and then Allende gave the plans to Pinochet, which was not a good idea. But that's an obvious moment. Also look at, for instance, the experience of the British Labour government in 74 to 76. Now, what I'm going to say has been fully reported by the BBC, has been the subject of documentaries in the UK, that essentially what we see are elements of the British military, far right-wing paramilitary groups, the MI5 and MI6, so domestic and foreign intelligence services in alignment with the CIA and the International Monetary Fund, come in and engage in a soft coup on the left Labour government of Wilson in 74 to 76, and then a rightward realignment that paves the way for Thatcher to come in. Against that was a left social democracy of Tony Benn, which said, no, let's move left. Let's use the revenues that are coming in to restabilize the pound as a result of the oil boom, et cetera, et cetera. But that was there was very little possibility for counter mobilization at that moment. So we shouldn't fool ourselves that capital is simply going to passively accept meaningful reforms that will limit their capacity to accumulate capital. Now, in the present moment, this is not 1945 or 1965, that there is no booming economy that is where the possibilities for investing surplus capital are appearing, or where there are new frontiers or new military dictatorships to be imposed, like the US did on Jakarta and the bloodbath that followed in 1965, Chile, countless other places around the world, the rule of the generals in Brazil, the overthrow of Lumumba, the execution of Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo, all of these places. That increasingly there is a zero-sum economic moment in terms of the accumulation of capital. That means that what's happening, and we see this very clearly with Washington's foreign policy, is that militarization is the answer to responding to potential threats. Look at what happened in Libya. Libya was the most prosperous, secular, advanced in all the common metrics country in Africa. And Gaddafi's threat was to move off the dollar and to threaten the CFA bloc. Libya was a prosperous country. Today, thanks to Hillary Clinton and Obama, there are open slave markets in Benghazi. All right, so this is when we think about local struggles, that we want to be aware that if these local struggles are not contained, and that is they become contagious, they spread to other places, there is a real political challenge, the forces of repression are going to come in immediately. And this is my concern when we have people on the left talking about how to blow up pipelines and essentially engage in violent acts of property destruction in order to force the state to do something. But if I live in the United States of America, which is essentially, in terms of its political life, has been governed by an internal security apparatus, maybe you in Turkey can relate, for a very, very long time. And that is something that will meet with a ferocious intensification of the security forces. We want to come up with a political strategy to mobilize against that, against the forces of the deep state and the internal security apparatuses.
Yeah, so I think Turkey is very familiar with this deep state and then the state intervention, like 1980 coup, and then there's another memorandum of 12 March 1972. I know it was last question, but there's just like another maybe just a little bit contribution, current politics. So there's a question. I will be here interested to hear Jason Moore discuss the philosophy of historical and dialectical materialism, as well as the current world events, like what's happening in Ukraine, Niger, Syria, from an anti-imperialist perspective. Like, what are your thoughts? What's going on, conflicts or over there?
Well, I've written on this. You can go to my website and see my essay, Imperialism, with and without cheap nature. And what I've said there is that what we're seeing in Ukraine is maybe not the first moment, but the beginning phase of a third world war, of another 30 years war. Capitalism so far has had three, one in the 17th century, one the Napoleonic and Republican wars of counter-revolution in the late 19th and early 20th, or late 18th and early 19th century. And then, of course, in the 20th century between 1914 and 45. Those were world wars within capitalism. This is over the shape of the world to come. We are clearly seeing the emergence of two great power blocks. One, the North Atlantic trilateralist bloc of Davos, of the Pentagon, Wall Street, etc., and then Belt and Road. Whether or not Belt and Road is an imperialist project or not remains to be seen. It is, I think, a post-capitalist transition strategy. So what is likely to happen is we are going to see an intensification and proliferation of these wars on the, I don't want to say peripheries because they are very central in many ways, but they will be outside of the imperialist core for now. However, there are very frightening developments. One is that almost overnight, we have seen the greatest rearmament, not just of Germany, but of also Japan since World War II. And this is driven by an American-centered imperialist bloc, but is in fact, as Bill Robinson has talked about, is a transnational capitalist bloc. And they are deeply committed to using that imperial power to secure the conditions of accumulation in one kind or another. So this is happening in Africa. There is, of course, the ongoing battleground in Latin America. We saw that the US coup in Bolivia drove Evo Morales out. We saw an effort by the CIA and NED elements to overthrow the Maduro government in Venezuela. Those are ongoing. We see the war in Syria. I mean, the war in Syria, right, is a regime change op. It's very, very clear, and a dirty war in the dirtiest sense possible. And as maybe the questioner knows, Ukraine is the NATO policy in Ukraine was partly a response to Russian policy to preserve the Assad regime in Syria. So this is very much a struggle between Belt and Road and the BRICS, broadly conceived, and a Euro-American Japanese consortium on the other. If we can't make sense of that in terms of climate crisis and climate justice, then we may as well go sell insurance. That it's the task of a geohistorical materialism in the web of life to understand this inter-imperialist conflict of a new kind, right? This is not a conflict over the spoils of capitalism. It is what kind of world order is going to follow. I don't think we need to be romantic, as some people are, about Belt and Road as some magical multipolar solution. I do think that what we need to be very conscious about is the stakes of what is happening within centrist liberalism in the Euro-American imperialist core, which is centrist liberals, including social democrats, are some of the greatest boosters of war now. And that should terrify us, because World War I and 30 years of World War were due to social democratic complicity in the war machines and the failure to launch general strikes against the war machine in the buildup to war in 1914 and the immediate outbreak of war. So we want to, I think, begin to grapple with these dialectics of world power in the web of life. That's what seems to be missing from a lot of the left analyses of what's happening today.
Well, Jason, thank you so much. It was very nice talk, and I think the questions also from the chats quite complemented to the argument that you were making, and also we could relate the current policy to politics. I want to thank you again for your participation and talk, and it was very nice to see you. This is like at the end of the talk. So we hope to see you all in our next installments. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those great questions. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.